He didn't sell the truck to pay off the loan. He didn't sell it to fix the barn roof that had been leaking since October, or to cover the heating bill that had been sitting unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks. He sold it. His '94 Ford F-3350, the one his father had left him, the one with 340,000 kilometers on it and a crack in the dashboard shaped like the Saskatchewan River, to buy a bus ticket for a 16-year-old boy nobody in Portage la Prairie believed was worth a second look. The whole town thought Clifford Tench had finally gone soft in the head. Maybe they were right. He was 53 years old, running a small equipment repair shop on the edge of town with a business account that rarely broke even, and he'd just handed the keys of his most valuable possession to a used vehicle dealer on Main Street for $4,200 cash. He walked home in the November cold with the bills folded in his breast pocket and didn't tell a single person what he planned to do with them. Clifford Tench was born in 1951 in a farmhouse 12 kilometers outside of Portage la Prairie, Manitoba, the second of 4 children. He was a broad man, not tall, maybe 5'10" in his work boots, with a square jaw that had gone gray years before the rest of him, and hands so callous they made a sound like dry leather when he rubbed them together. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of winter sky over a frozen field, and they didn't blink much. People who didn't know him sometimes thought he was angry. People who did know him understood that was just how Clifford looked at the world. Steady, patient, like he was waiting for something that would come in its own time. He'd never married. There had been a woman once in his late 30s, a schoolteacher named Marion, who'd come to Portage for 2 years and left when the posting ended. They'd written letters for a while. Then they hadn't. Clifford kept her photograph in his sock drawer and didn't look at it more than once or twice a year. His shop was called Tench & Son, a name his father had painted on the sign in 1973, optimistic about a future son who'd eventually arrived, but shown no interest whatsoever in carburetors or hydraulic systems. The son, Derek, now lived in Vancouver doing something with computers that Clifford couldn't explain if asked. They spoke at Christmas, sometimes Easter. The boy's name was Avery Colt. Avery Colt was 16 years and 4 months old when he walked into Clifford's shop on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, asking if there was any work he could do for food. He was 5'7" and thin in the way that isn't lean, the way that comes from not eating enough for too long. His hair was dark brown, grown out past his ears in an uneven way that suggested he cut it himself when he could find scissors. He had a bruise on the left side of his jaw that was 2 or 3 days old, yellowing at the edges, and his jacket, a thin nylon thing, dark green, not remotely suited for a Manitoba November, had a broken zipper held shut with a safety pin. He had a backpack with him. It didn't look heavy. Clifford was underneath a John Deere 6110 when Avery walked in, and he slid out slowly, sat up on the creeper, and looked at the boy for a long moment without saying anything. "I can sweep," Avery said. "Clean up, whatever you need." Clifford noticed the bruise. He noticed the jacket. He noticed that the boy was standing with his weight slightly forward on his toes, like someone who'd learned to be ready to run. "Have you eaten today?" Clifford asked. Avery hesitated 1 beat too long. "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." Another pause. "No." Clifford got up off the creeper and walked to the small office at the back of the shop, where he had a bar fridge and a hot plate. He put a pot of soup on, canned tomato, nothing special, and cut 4 slices of bread and didn't say anything else until it was ready. Avery ate standing up at the workbench, which told Clifford something. People who were used to being told to leave ate standing up. It was faster that way. "Where are you staying?" Clifford asked. "Around. Around where in November?" The boy looked at him. He had dark eyes, darker than his hair, and there was something in them that wasn't quite defiance, more like the last edge of a boundary that hadn't yet been crossed. "I'm okay," Clifford nodded. He pulled a stool over from next to the drill press and sat down. "My name's Clifford Tench. I own this shop. I'm going to ask you something and I'd like you to answer me honestly, and then whatever you say, I'll leave it alone. All right? Avery watched him. Is there somewhere safe you can go tonight? The boy's jaw tightened. He looked down at the bread in his hand, and then, very quietly, he said, no. That was November 19th, 1987. What had brought Avery Colt to Portage la Prairie was a story Clifford learned in pieces over the following weeks, not all at once. The boy wasn't a talker. He'd grown up in Winnipeg with his mother and her second husband, a man named Gerald who'd worked at a loading dock and had a drinking problem that had started as a weekend thing and become a daily thing by the time Avery was 12. His mother, Sandra, had loved Avery in the way that some people love, intensely when things were good, and completely overwhelmed when they weren't. Gerald hadn't hurt Avery with his hands, not often. He'd hurt him in the slower ways. The dismissal, the contempt, the particular cruelty of making a child feel like an inconvenience in his own home. Avery had stopped going to school in October of grade 10, not because he was stupid. Clifford would come to understand, over time, that Avery was quietly, observationally smart in ways that didn't show up on report cards. But because the school was 20 minutes by bus, and he'd been too tired from working nights at a gas station to stay awake in class, and Gerald had told him that if he wasn't contributing to the household he could get out, so he'd started working. And then one night in early November, Gerald had come home from a shift in a particular kind of mood, and Avery had said something back. Clifford never knew what, and that had been the end of it. He'd packed his backpack and left. He'd been walking, or riding buses when he had the money, for nearly 2 weeks when he found Portage la Prairie. He'd chosen Clifford's shop because there was a light on and the door was unlocked, and it smelled like motor oil and metal shavings, which were, for reasons Avery couldn't fully articulate, smells that felt safe. Clifford let him sleep in the back room on a folding cot that first night. Then the second. By the end of the week, he'd moved the cot into the corner near the furnace and brought a proper blanket from the house and stopped pretending it was temporary. He didn't call the children's aid. He thought about it. He went as far as picking up the phone twice. But something in the way Avery went quiet whenever there was any talk of authorities, the way his shoulders pulled up like an animal hearing a sound it recognized as danger, made Clifford set the phone back down. He told himself he'd reassess. He kept reassessing and kept not calling. What Clifford did instead was put Avery to work, not as a favor, as a job. He paid him. Not much, $14 a day to start, which was what the job was worth. And he taught him things. Not in a formal way, not with any plan behind it. He just worked, and Avery watched, and Clifford answered questions when they were asked. Avery asked good questions. He wanted to understand why, not just how, and Clifford respected that. Most people wanted to know the sequence of steps. Avery wanted to know the reason behind each step, which was the harder and more useful thing to know. By January, Avery could do a basic engine diagnostic. By March, he was doing oil changes and filter replacements on his own. By May, Clifford was leaving him to handle simple jobs while he went out on farm calls. Avery went back to school. Clifford didn't ask him to. The boy did it himself, quietly, without announcement. He enrolled at the local high school in January, and went in the mornings before the shop opened. He didn't make friends easily. He didn't talk about where he was living. In the spring, there was a discussion. Clifford brought it up on a Tuesday evening when they were closing up the shop. He'd been thinking about it since February, going back and forth, and he'd decided the best thing was to say it plainly. There's a technical training program in Regina, he said. Diesel mechanics, 2 years. Affiliated with Siest, he slid a brochure across the workbench. I think you should apply. Avery looked at the brochure without picking it up. I can't afford that, I know, and I'm not done school yet. They have a mature student intake. You'd be 17 by September. You could sit the equivalency exam. Avery looked at him. You looked into this. I did. Why? Clifford was quiet for a moment. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands, which didn't need wiping. "Because you're good at this," he said. "Better than good. And I don't want to watch you spend your whole life doing oil changes in Portage la Prairie, because nobody told you that you had options." He paused. "No offense to Portage la Prairie." The boy almost smiled. Almost. The tuition was $4,000 for the first year, with housing and materials on top of that. Clifford didn't have it. His shop account was thin, his personal savings were thinner, and his truck, the F-350 his father had left him, the one he'd been planning to run until it wouldn't run anymore, was the only thing he owned that was worth anything. He sold it to Russell Dewar, a farmer on the east side of town who'd been asking about it for 2 years. $4,200. Clifford took $4,000 and put it in a bank draft in Avery Colt's name for tuition and first month's housing. He kept the $200 for parts he'd already ordered and couldn't cancel. He didn't tell Avery where the money came from. Not at first. He said he'd found a grant, a partial truth, or close enough, since Clifford had decided that the money was no longer his, and therefore it was a kind of gift, which was a kind of grant. Avery accepted it with the look of someone who suspected he wasn't being given the full story, but didn't yet have the standing to push. He left for Regina in September of 1989. He was 17 years old, carrying the same backpack. Better filled now, with an actual winter jacket that Clifford had bought him in March. And he shook Clifford's hand at the bus depot in a way that was formal and slightly stiff, the way young men sometimes shake hands when they don't know how to say what they actually mean. "I'll pay you back," Avery said. "You don't owe me anything," Clifford said. The bus pulled out. Clifford drove home in a borrowed truck. He'd borrowed it from his friend Hervab Stadnik, who ran a supply company and didn't ask many questions, and made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table for a while. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen next. He wasn't sure he expected anything. What happened next, or the first part of it, was that Avery wrote letters. Not many. 3 in the first year, 2 in the second. But they were long letters, detailed. The kind of letters that showed Avery was working through something by writing it down. He was doing well in the program. He was in the top third of his class. He'd found a part-time job at a garage near the campus. He'd made a friend, a guy from Saskatoon named Theo, who was funny and reliable, which were, Avery noted, rarer qualities than people seemed to realize. After the second year, the letters slowed. After the third year, they stopped. Clifford understood. He told himself he understood. He was a practical man who believed in letting people get on with their lives. He kept the letters in the kitchen drawer under the phone. There were 7 in total, and he didn't read them very often, but he didn't throw them out either. He got a card for Christmas 1993 with a Calgary postmark. No return address. It said, "Hope you're well. AC." That was the last he heard. The years that followed were ordinary years. Clifford ran the shop. The shop had good stretches and harder stretches, and through all of them, Clifford showed up every morning at 7:30 and unlocked the door and did the work. He hired a young man named Daryl in 1994, who stayed 4 years and was adequate. He hired a woman named Pat in 1999, who was better than adequate and stayed 11 years. He got older. His back started giving him trouble in his early 60s. He cut down to 4 days a week, then 3. In 2006, he had a small heart incident. Not a full attack, the cardiologist was careful to say, more of a warning, and spent 4 days in the Portage hospital. Derek came from Vancouver for a week, and it was the longest they'd spent together in 15 years. And it was both good and strange, and when Derek left again, they promised to call more often, and they almost managed it. The shop's furnace died in the winter of 2009, and the replacement cost more than Clifford had, and he took out a loan that he spent the next 4 years paying down. He sold the back quarter of the property in 2011 to cover the property taxes. He kept going. He was 68 years old in 2019, and he was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep, the bone-deep kind. the kind that comes from 30 years of lifting engines and crawling under chassis and breathing grease and hydraulic fluid. His knees ached in cold weather. His right shoulder had a grinding sound in it that the doctor called arthritis, and that Clifford called inconvenient. The shop was still open, but it wasn't making money the way it used to, and he'd been thinking, quietly, in the back of his mind, about what the end of things would look like. He hadn't made any decisions. He wasn't the kind of man who made decisions before he had to. In February of 2020, a man walked into Tension's Sun on a Thursday morning. He was about 48 years old. He was 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples and a short, neat beard. He wore a canvas work jacket and steel-toed boots, and he moved through the door of the shop the way people move through doorways when they've learned to pay attention to spaces. Quietly, with a quick scan of the room before committing to walking into it, he stood inside the door for a moment and looked around at the shop, the tool chests, the lift, the smell of grease and metal and old coffee. And something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite sadness. It was something in between. The expression of a person recognizing something they'd carried in memory for a very long time. Clifford was at the counter, going through an invoice. He looked up. He didn't recognize him, not at first. Not for 3 or 4 seconds, which was long enough for the man to see that he didn't recognize him, and for something complicated to happen in the man's expression in response, and then Clifford recognized him. Avery, he said. Avery Colt, 48 years old, broad-shouldered and silver-templed, and no longer moving like someone ready to run, said, "Hey, Clifford." They shook hands. Then Avery did something he probably hadn't planned to do. He put his other hand on Clifford's forearm, just briefly, and then let go, and Clifford understood that the handshake was doing a lot of work. They sat in the office with the hot plate and the bar fridge. Clifford made coffee, proper coffee, not the burnt stuff, and Avery sat on the same stool he'd used to sit on when he was 16, which was now held together by a bolt. Clifford had replaced sometime in the mid-90s. "I should have been in touch sooner," Avery said. Clifford waved this off. "You had a life to build." "That's what I told myself." Avery looked at his hands around the coffee mug. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't entirely right either. He'd finished the program in Regina, he said, got his journeyman certification. Worked for 3 years at a fleet maintenance company in Calgary. Clifford remembered the Christmas card. Then he'd moved to Edmonton, worked his way up to shop foreman at a company that serviced heavy equipment for the oil sands, saved money, took a business course at night. And in 2001, he'd started his own company, Colt Industrial Services, based in Fort Saskatchewan, specializing in field maintenance and emergency repair for heavy equipment. He had, at present, 43 service trucks and 61 employees. Clifford looked at him. 61, Clifford said. 63 as of next month. 2 new hires starting March 1st. Clifford sat with this for a moment. Outside the shop window, the February sky was the color of old concrete. "Why did you wait?" Clifford asked. Not accusing, he genuinely wanted to understand. "All this time." Avery was quiet for a moment. He turned the mug in his hands. "When I left," he said slowly, "I told you I'd pay you back. And you told me I didn't owe you anything. And he stopped, tried again. "I spent a long time trying to figure out which one of us was right, and building something felt like the only way to find out." He looked up. "I wanted to come back with something real, not just a check. I didn't want to come back until I had something to offer. I didn't need anything offered," Clifford said. "I know, but I did." Avery met his eyes. "I needed to know that what you did, what it cost you, I needed to make sure it went somewhere." Clifford didn't say anything for a while. "Your truck," Avery said. Clifford looked at him. "I didn't know for a long time," Avery said. "I found out later. I ran into someone from here years ago, and they mentioned it. Said you had sold your dad's truck to help some kid nobody remembered." He paused. "I remembered." Clifford felt something shift behind his sternum, some old weight he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing it. "How did you?" "I want to buy you a truck," Avery said, "or whatever you need." "But that's not the main reason I'm here." He explained the rest of it over the next hour. Colt Industrial Services was expanding into Manitoba, opening a regional depot in Portage la Prairie. It was geographically practical, on the Trans-Canada corridor, good access to agricultural equipment clients in the surrounding area. The depot would need space, administrative support, field coordination. It would bring work to the area, and he wanted to name the training program after Clifford. "What training program?" Clifford said. "The one we're setting up," Avery said, "in partnership with the Polytechnic. Paid apprenticeships, diesel mechanics, hydraulic systems, mobile equipment maintenance, 12 spots per intake. For people who need the chance, young people who aren't going to come to it through traditional routes." He paused. "People like I was." Clifford looked at him for a long time. "You can say no," Avery said. "To the name thing, I mean. I'd do it either way." "I'm not going to say no," Clifford said. He stopped. Tried to find the right words, which had never been his strongest suit. "I just want to understand why you're doing this." Avery looked at him, and for a moment he was 16 again. Dark eyes, the last edge of a boundary, a boy who'd answered a question honestly when he didn't have to. "Because you fed me soup," he said, "in November, when you didn't know me and you had no reason to." The trucks arrived on a Monday. It was the second week of March 2020, and the snow was still thick on the ground outside Portage la Prairie, and Clifford was at the shop, at 7:30 the way he always was, and at 8:15 he looked out the window and saw the first truck turn off the highway onto his road. Then the second. Then a third, and a fourth, and then more than he could count at a glance. 43 Colt Industrial Service trucks, white with the company logo on the side, pulling into the lot and the road adjacent to it, parking in a line that stretched back farther than he could see from the window. The drivers got out, men and women in canvas jackets, most of them, some drinking coffee from travel mugs, all of them moving with the unhurried confidence of people who were good at what they did. Behind the service trucks came 3 flat op-eds carrying equipment. Behind those, a pickup, and Avery Colt stepped out of it. He walked up to the shop door, and Clifford was already standing in it. "I thought you were opening the depot in May," Clifford said. "We are," Avery said. "This is something else." He turned and looked at the line of trucks, and something in his face was quietly satisfied. "I told the crew what I was doing and why. Asked if anyone wanted to make the drive." He paused. 43 trucks didn't fit in your lot, so we've got people parked down to the gas station." Clifford stood in the door of tension sun for a long moment. The February sky that had been the color of old concrete 2 weeks ago had broken into something cleaner. The morning light came sideways across the snow and caught the white trucks and made them glow. "They didn't have to do that," Clifford said. "No," Avery agreed, "they didn't." Among the people who arrived that March morning was a woman named Della Sowerby, 31 years old, shop foreman at the Edmonton Depot, with a mechanical engineering diploma and a way of explaining hydraulic systems that made even the complicated parts seem logical. She shook Clifford's hand with both of hers. There was a man named Theo Brandt, who turned out to be the same Theo from Saskatoon, Avery's friend from the Regina program, now Colt Industrial's operations manager. A tall man with a red beard and a loud laugh who brought donuts. There was a young man named Sebastian Quill, 19 years old, who'd been the first person accepted into the pilot apprenticeship intake. He was from a reserve community north of Edmonton. He'd never met Clifford, but he shook his hand and said, "I heard about you. From Avery. He made it sound like you were pretty ordinary." He grinned. He meant it as a compliment. The Clifford Tench Trades Foundation held its first intake in September of 2020. 12 apprentices. Paid placements. Full certification pathway. Clifford was invited to the orientation as a guest speaker, which he found mildly alarming. He'd given perhaps 4 speeches in his entire life, and 2 of them were toasts at other people's weddings. But he went because Avery asked, and because he'd spent his whole life showing up to things that needed doing. He stood in front of 12 young people in a converted workshop space in Portage la Prairie and said what he had to say, which was not very much, and said it in the plainest language he could find. He said that when he'd helped Avery colt 30 years earlier, he hadn't done it because he expected anything. He'd done it because the boy was 16 and cold and hadn't eaten, and there was soup on the hot plate. That was all. There was no plan behind it. There was no investment strategy or calculus of return. There was a kid who needed something and a situation in which Clifford happened to have it. He said that the most important thing he'd ever learned about work, about any kind of work, with engines or with people, was that you had to be willing to take something apart before you could understand how it worked. That patience and attention were not passive qualities, that you could tell a great deal about a person by the questions they asked. He said that he was deeply and genuinely grateful to be standing in that room, that he had not expected to end up here. He said that he hoped each of them found something worth being patient for. Sebastian Quill, in the second row, wrote that last part down in his notebook. Later, he'd put it on a card that he kept on the dashboard of his service truck, because Sebastian Quill graduated from the Clifford Tench Foundation's in 2022 and was hired by Colt Industrial and drove a white service truck through the winters of northern Alberta with a card on his dash that said, "Something worth being patient for." Clifford Tench retired in 2021. Tench and Son, still bearing the name his father had painted with optimism in 1973, closed quietly on a Thursday afternoon in April, with no ceremony and no sign in the window. Clifford locked the door and stood outside for a moment, and then walked home. He was 69 years old. His knees still ached in cold weather. His shoulder still ground when he reached too high. He had a garden that needed work, and a kitchen table where he drank tea in the mornings, and a sock drawer where he still kept a photograph he didn't look at very often. He had a truck, a 2019 Ford F-350, dark blue, with 0 kilometers on it when Avery had handed him the keys 2 years earlier. It ran perfectly. He drove it to church on Sundays and to the hardware store on Saturdays, and occasionally, when the weather was good and the Trans-Canada was clear, just drove it for a while, west toward Brandon or east toward Winnipeg, watching the fields go by. He hadn't expected anything, not 30 years ago, not now. He'd fed a boy soup and taught him things and sold a truck he loved to give him a chance, and then let him go, because that was the whole point. You didn't help people in order to keep them. You helped them so they could leave and go build something and come back someday, if they chose to, carrying something real. Avery had chosen to. That was the part nobody in Portage la Prairie had predicted. Not in 1987, when they'd thought Clifford had lost his mind, and not in 2020, when 43 trucks turned off the Trans-Canada onto his road in the morning light. Clifford had not predicted it either. He hadn't been thinking that far ahead. He'd just left the door unlocked and the light on.